The scent of fresh lavender paint was meant to signal the arrival of my daughter. Today, it tasted like ash in the back of my throat. I stood in the doorway of the nursery, the chill of the Washington rain still clinging to the hem of my trench coat. My lower back carried the familiar heavy ache that came with being 7 months pregnant and working 10-hour days as a corporate auditor. But the physical strain faded into a sharp, paralyzing numbness as I stared at the center of the room. My husband David stood holding a piece of mahogany. It was the side rail of the crib we had spent 3 hours assembling just last weekend. He held a hex wrench in his other hand, systematically dismantling the bed our child was supposed to sleep in. He did not look caught. He did not look guilty. He looked inconvenienced by my arrival. "You are home early," David said. He set the wood against the baseboard with a hollow thud that echoed against the freshly painted walls. Before I could form a response, the heavy metallic roll of luggage wheels vibrated through the hallway floorboards. Julian, David's younger brother, pushed past my shoulder without a word of greeting. He dragged 2 oversized aluminum designer suitcases into the small room. He wore a pristine cashmere sweater and a silver watch that retailed for more than my first car. Yet he carried the demanding posture of someone claiming a luxury suite, not a man desperate for shelter. "What is this?" I asked. I forced my voice to stay flat, swallowing the sheer disbelief rising in my chest. "Julian needs a place to stay," David replied. He wiped a smudge of dust from his hands onto his raw denim jeans, not meeting my eyes. "He will take the nursery for now." I looked at the disassembled crib pieces scattered across the rug. Then I looked at Julian, who was already tossing his heavy leather duffel onto the plush nursing chair I had painstakingly chosen months ago. I rested a hand protectively over my swollen stomach. "I am 7 months pregnant, David. Where will the baby sleep?" David finally looked at me, his expression as cold as the November downpour hitting the window panes. "You will figure something out. It is temporary. If you have ever had the person you promised your life to look you in the eye and dismiss your existence with a single sentence, you know the exact kind of freezing silence that took root in my chest." I want to ask you something before I continue. How old were you when you realized you had to step up and be your own protector? Share your age in the comments, and welcome to Salt Vengeance. You are going to want to stay to see exactly how I figured it out. Julian did not wait for my reaction. He unzipped his duffel bag, the sharp sound tearing through the quiet tension in the room. He began pulling out tangles of charging cables, a stack of folded designer shirts, and a heavy glass bottle of cologne. Within seconds, the sharp, peppery scent of his expensive fragrance overpowered the faint, clean smell of lavender paint I had spent weeks picking out. "Move some of this stuff, will you?" Julian muttered to his brother. He gestured toward the white wooden changing table nestled in the corner. David nodded, picking up a stack of folded baby blankets and tossing them onto the floor. Julian stepped up to the table to set up his gaming console. As he cleared a space, his hand knocked against a small, intricate object resting near the edge. It was a vintage silver rattle. The handle was etched with tiny ivy leaves, the metal slightly tarnished from decades of love. My grandmother had given it to me the day I was born, and I had placed it on the changing table that morning, imagining my own daughter holding it. Julian did not pause to examine it. He flicked his wrist, tossing the silver heirloom toward a taped-up cardboard box labeled "For the Basement." It landed with a dull, hollow clink against a pile of spare linens. "Watch your hands." I said the words, slipping out low and sharp. Julian turned, leaning his weight against the changing table. He let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, rolling his eyes, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. "Relax, Emma. It is just metal. Look, I would not even be here if my bank had not locked me out this morning. Some glitch with the crypto exchange triggered a security hold. I am stressed enough without you breathing down my neck." A glitch. The phrase echoed in my mind. My professional instincts, sharpened by a decade of auditing digital media portfolios and tracking hidden assets, instantly flared to life. I spent my days dissecting financial discrepancies for corporate clients. I knew the anatomy of a lie. Men who wore limited edition luxury watches and traveled with aluminum luggage did not suddenly need to commandeer their unborn niece's nursery over a routine banking error. A locked crypto account did not render a man homeless in a matter of hours. Something else was bleeding him dry. "It is being handled," David interjected. He stepped deliberately between me and his brother, shielding Julian from my gaze. He pointed a hex wrench toward the hallway. "Go to the kitchen, make yourself some tea, and sit down. You are working yourself up over nothing. Let us finish in here." He spoke to me with the tone one might use on a misbehaving dog. He expected tears. He expected me to raise my voice to demand an argument he could easily win by labeling me hysterical. He wanted the fight so he could justify his cruelty. I looked at the disassembled crib. I looked at the man I had married standing shoulder to shoulder with a brother who treated my home like a cheap hotel. I turned on my heel and walked away. The heavy silence of the house pressed against my eardrums as I moved down the hallway. My footsteps felt unsteady, the extra weight of my pregnancy pulling at my center of gravity, but I kept my posture rigid. I entered the kitchen. The white marble countertops were pristine, bathed in the gray afternoon light filtering through the blinds. Everything was exactly where it belonged, save for a single item resting near the espresso machine. It was a thick, black USB device, roughly the size of a deck of cards. I recognized it immediately. It was a remote online notary drive, a highly secure digital tool used to verify high-stakes real estate signatures and authorize binding financial documents. David's business partner used one for commercial property acquisitions. David did not work in real estate. He managed logistics for a regional supply chain. He had zero reason to possess a secure digital notary seal in our kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon. I stared at the tiny blinking green light on the side of the device. The jagged puzzle pieces hovered in my mind, refusing to align. My husband had just dismantled our child's room to house a brother, draped in luxury but supposedly bankrupt. Julian's accounts were frozen, and David possessed a device designed specifically to bypass physical, in-person signatures for major financial transactions. My pulse shifted from a frantic flutter into a slow, rhythmic drum. If I confronted them now, I would be walking into a trap blind. They had a plan. They had a timeline. I was nothing more than an obstacle they expected to manage with intimidation and dismissive cruelty. I reached into the cabinet and pulled down a ceramic mug. I filled it with tap water and placed it in the microwave, punching the buttons with precise, calculated movements. I needed them to feel safe. I needed them to believe their intimidation had worked perfectly. When the microwave beeped, I carried the hot mug of water past the nursery. Julian was already blasting music from a portable speaker, the bass vibrating through the floorboards. David was folding down the last side of the crib. "I am going to lie down in the guest room," I called out, keeping my voice small, thin, and defeated. "I am too tired to argue with you right now." David glanced over his shoulder, a flicker of smug satisfaction crossing his features. "Good idea. Rest." I closed the door to the guest bedroom and locked it silently. I set the mug on the nightstand and pulled my noise-canceling headphones from my work tote. I slipped them over my ears, leaving them powered off. To anyone opening the door, I would look like a broken, exhausted woman seeking refuge in a podcast too overwhelmed to fight back. Instead, I pulled my work laptop from my bag and booted it up. The screen cast a pale blue glow across the darkened room. I was a senior auditor. I found the money people thought they had hidden safely away. If David wanted to treat our marriage like a hostile takeover, he was about to learn exactly what kind of opponent he had invited to the table. I opened a secure browser window and typed in the IP address for our home network router, my fingers flying across the keys. The digital hunt had begun. As I sat on the edge of the guest bed, a sharp kick against my ribs forced me to catch my breath. I placed a hand over the spot, feeling the undeniable reality of the life growing inside me. This house, a sprawling two-story craftsman in a quiet Seattle suburb, was supposed to be her safe haven. I had paid the down payment entirely from my own savings. I managed the mortgage. David handled the utilities and his own expenses. We kept our finances largely separate, a practical arrangement that suddenly felt like a gaping vulnerability. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the sterile scent of the guest room ground me. I thought about my career. For the past 6 years, I managed extensive digital media portfolios. I tracked revenue streams for major content creators, untangling complex webs of offshore accounts and hidden sponsorships. I had built a reputation for possessing a surgical precision when it came to numbers. My firm relied on me to find the leaks that executives tried to bury. I opened the home network interface. David was not a tech genius. He used the same variations of passwords he had used since we met. Within 3 attempts, I bypassed his basic security wall and gained access to the router's administrative logs. From there, I mirrored the traffic coming from his personal desktop in the home office downstairs. The data parsed across my screen in neat, cascading lines. I filtered the search for recent financial documents, PDF attachments, and secure cloud links. I was looking for the anomaly, the thread that would unravel the sudden presence of a remote notary drive and a brother with frozen crypto accounts. It did not take long. A folder labeled Tax Prep 2026 caught my eye. It was modified less than 2 hours ago. I clicked the icon, my breathing shallow, my eyes scanning the contents. Inside, past the standard tax forms and utility bills, sat a single PDF titled Equity Release Final. I opened the document. The bright white of the digital page illuminated the dark guest room. It was an application for a home equity loan. The loan amount requested was $400,000, secured directly against the Washington property I had purchased. I scrolled down, my eyes darting past the dense legal jargon, searching for the authorization page. There, at the very bottom, sat 2 signatures. The first was David's, scrawled in his familiar, messy script. The second signature was mine. It was a flawless, digitized copy of my handwriting. Beneath it sat the crisp blue digital stamp of the remote online notary drive I had just seen sitting next to my espresso machine. The authorization verified that I had been present, that I had presented my identification, and that I had consented to stripping the equity from my own home to fund a cash payout routed to a holding company I had never heard of. My stomach dropped, plunging into an abyss of cold, hard reality. The nursery was not the only thing David was dismantling. He was liquidating my sanctuary. He was stealing the ground beneath my feet while convincing me to argue over the paint on the walls. I stared at the forged signature, a perfect replication of my identity, weaponized against me. The tension in my jaw tightened until my teeth ached. He thought I was distracted. He thought the pregnancy made me weak, slow, and easy to manipulate. A second sharp kick hit my ribs. I placed my hand over my stomach again, the fear evaporating into a terrifying, icy resolve. "I see you," I whispered to the empty room. The signature on the screen was a perfect replica of my own. I traced the curves of the digital letters with my index finger against the cold glass of the monitor. My husband had mapped my identity, digitized it, and applied it to a contract designed to drain the equity from the home I purchased. Through my noise-canceling headphones, the gentle rhythmic voice of a narrator from the Sophia Told Stories podcast played in my ears. I turned the volume up just enough to drown out the heavy footsteps echoing from the hallway. Julian was pacing. David was dragging boxes across the hardwood floor. They thought the closed bedroom door meant victory. They assumed I had retreated to lick my wounds, broken by their unified front. The podcast host spoke about finding peace in the center of a storm. I was not looking for peace. I was mapping the storm. My fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced, silent rhythm. This was not unfamiliar territory. For the past 6 years, I built a career doing exactly this. As a senior digital media auditor, my daily routine involved tearing apart the financial structures of high-net-worth portfolios. When a massive channel, like Easy Finance Today, generated vast sums in ad revenue and sponsored content, the money often fractured into dozens of convoluted holding accounts. Executives would bury profits in shell companies, hoping the sheer complexity would deter any real scrutiny. My firm sent me in when the numbers stopped making sense. I remembered sitting in a glass-walled conference room 3 years ago, handing a 100-page forensic report to my managing partner. He flipped through the meticulously color-coded tabs, shook his head, and looked up at me. He praised my unique ability to find the money people think they have hidden. I track digital footprints for a living. David had just left muddy boots all over our shared network. I downloaded the equity release final PDF to a secure, encrypted folder on my local drive. I needed to know where the funds were going. A home equity loan of that size did not just sit in a standard checking account waiting to be spent. I opened the network administrative panel again, easily bypassing David's rudimentary security protocols. He used a variation of our wedding anniversary for everything. I accessed his synced email client, the screen reflecting a pale blue light across my face. I sorted his inbox by attachments and flagged priority messages from the past 30 days. A thread labeled Project Oasis caught my attention immediately. The sender was a boutique financial consulting firm based in Delaware. I opened the initial email. It contained a wire routing number and a set of instructions for the incoming loan disbursement. The beneficiary was not Julian. The beneficiary was not a struggling cryptocurrency exchange. The account belonged to a limited liability company registered just 2 months ago. I cross-referenced the corporate entity name with the state registry database. The registered agent was David. My husband had set up a corporate shell specifically to receive the funds stripped from my house. He told me Julian was broke. He told me Julian needed the nursery because his accounts were frozen. Those were lies designed to create chaos, a smokescreen to keep me distracted and arguing over room arrangements while the bank processed the final paperwork for a 6-figure theft. I dug further into the email thread, my breathing turning shallow. A message from the loan officer sent yesterday afternoon confirmed the property appraisal had been waived due to our excellent credit history. The final step was the notarized authorization. David had supplied that today, using the digital drive sitting next to our espresso machine. The loan officer's closing line burned into my vision. The funds will be released for transfer within 48 hours of receiving the signed documents. 48 hours. 2 days. The air in the guest room suddenly felt thin, failing to reach my lungs. I needed to block the transfer. I needed to call the fraud department at the bank immediately. But doing so would trigger an automated alert to David. He would know I was inside his network. He would know I found the forgery. I was in a house with 2 men who had just demonstrated they possessed zero moral boundaries when it came to securing their financial future at my expense. A loud crash reverberated through the drywall, followed by Julian shouting a string of curses. I slipped one headphone off my ear, leaning closer to the bedroom door. "I told you to be careful with that monitor," David hissed, his voice muffled but sharp. "Keep your voice down. She is sleeping." "I do not care if she is sleeping," Julian snapped back, his tone frantic. "The investors are calling my lawyer every single hour. If that transfer does not clear by Friday, they are going to file formal charges. You promised me this was handled." "It is handled," David replied. His tone was laced with a cold, calculating edge I had never heard from him before. "The file was uploaded an hour ago. The house equity will cover the deficit. Just play along until the money hits the account, and then we will deal with Emma. She will not have the resources to fight a protracted legal battle once the lien is secured. She will have to sell, and we take our half." The floor beneath me seemed to tilt. They were not just taking the equity. They were planning to force a sale of the property, bury me in legal fees, and walk away with the proceeds to pay off Julian's defrauded investors. David was sacrificing my financial independence, my home, and my future to save his brother from a criminal indictment. He intended to leave his pregnant wife destitute. A sudden, sharp cramp seized my lower abdomen, radiating across my back. I gasped, dropping my hands to my swollen stomach. It was not the dull ache of a long commute. It was a searing, distinct band of pain that pulled my muscles taut. I checked the digital clock in the corner of my computer screen. It was early evening. Another cramp hit stronger than the first, stealing the breath from my throat. The adrenaline, the stress, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal were flooding my nervous system, triggering a biological cascade I could not stop. I took a short, shallow breath, trying to force my heart rate to slow down. My doctor had warned me about elevated blood pressure. I had to stay calm. I had to keep the decoy intact. I reached for my phone on the nightstand to text my obstetrician. Before my fingers could unlock the screen, a warm, unmistakable rush of fluid soaked through my clothes, pooling onto the mattress beneath me. I stared down at the dark stain spreading across the gray bed sheets. I was exactly 30 weeks pregnant. My daughter was not due for another 2 months. Her nursery was dismantled. My husband was standing on the other side of the bedroom door, plotting my financial ruin. And I was going into premature labor alone. The dark stain spreading across the gray bedsheets commanded all my attention. My breath hitched, trapping stale air in my lungs. 30 weeks. It was far too early. The searing band of pain wrapping around my lower abdomen forced me to grip the edge of the mattress. My body was overriding my plans, accelerating a timeline I could not control. I had to leave the house. More importantly, I had to leave without alerting the men downstairs. I reached for my leather work tote, carefully sliding my laptop inside. Every movement triggered a fresh wave of agony across my lower back. Down the hall, the television blasted a sports broadcast, masking the sound of my ragged breathing. Julian was shouting at the screen, cheering a penalty call. David laughed, a deep, resonant sound that echoed up the stairwell. If I called out to my husband, he would drive me to the emergency room. He would hover in the triage bay. He would play the role of the terrified, devoted partner in front of the medical staff. Worse, he would manage my care, confiscating my phone and ensuring I remained isolated from my digital accounts while I recovered. I refused to be a captive audience to his performance. I needed my devices, and I needed my autonomy. I ordered a premium rideshare service using a silent prompt on my phone. Clutching the banister, I crept down the back staircase, bypassing the living room entirely. Slipping out the side door, the freezing Washington rain hit my face like shattered glass. The cold shock snapped my focus into place. A black sedan idled at the curb. The driver, an older woman with sharp, observant eyes, took one look at my pale face and sped toward Seattle General without uttering a single question. The transition from the damp car to the sterile, glaring environment of the maternity ward felt like crossing into an alien dimension. The triage nurses swarmed instantly. Synthetic fabrics rustled as they strapped a fetal monitor to my contracting abdomen. Needles pierced my veins, establishing intravenous lines in a matter of seconds. The smell of harsh antiseptic and bleached cotton filled my nostrils. Then came the sound. The rhythm of my unborn daughter's heartbeat filled the small clinical bay. It was erratic, a frantic, fluttering noise that spiked high before dipping dangerously low. The medical staff exchanged tense, wordless glances over my bed. I recognized that specific brand of silent communication. It was the exact same look senior partners gave each other when a corporate ledger failed a multi-million-dollar compliance audit. Something fundamental was breaking down. A nurse handed me my phone, suggesting I contact my partner immediately. My fingers trembled as I dialed David's number. The line rang 4 times before diverting to his generic voicemail greeting. I did not leave a message. Instead, I opened a location-sharing application he had installed years ago and subsequently forgot to disable. A blue dot pulsed on the digital map. The tracker placed his phone inside an upscale downtown lounge known for rare bourbons and exorbitant cover charges. He was out celebrating his impending windfall. He was raising a glass with the brother who intended to render me destitute, while his child fought a losing battle against her own erratic heartbeat. The physical pain intensified, slicing through my core with relentless precision. The attending physician entered the room, her expression grim and authoritative. She reviewed the scrolling paper output from the monitor. "We cannot wait," the doctor stated, her voice cutting through the clinical hum. "The baby is under severe distress. We are moving to an emergency surgical delivery right now." The operating theater was a blinding cavern of stainless steel and sharp halogen beams. The anesthesiologist administered the spinal block, sending a heavy, freezing wave down my legs. I stared at the square ceiling tiles, counting the perforations to keep my mind tethered to reality. My career taught me to detach emotion from raw data in order to survive high-pressure scenarios. I mapped out financial irregularities for a living, isolating the truth from the noise. The data in this room was terrifying. I was undergoing major abdominal surgery. My infant was struggling for survival. My spouse was the architect of my financial demise. A sharp pressure tugged at my center. A few moments later, a thin, fragile cry broke the suffocating tension in the room. It was a tiny noise, barely louder than the hum of the surgical equipment. I tried to lift my head, but the blue, sterile drape blocked my view. "She is small, but she is breathing," the pediatrician announced. They did not hand her to me. A team of neonatal specialists swarmed the tiny infant, transferring her swiftly into a mobile incubator. I caught a fleeting glimpse of translucent skin and thin plastic tubing before they rushed her out the double doors toward the neonatal intensive care unit. The profound emptiness in my chest instantly rivaled the physical void in my abdomen. Time dissolved into a haze of pain medication and hushed medical jargon. I drifted in and out of consciousness in the dimly lit recovery room. The rhythmic hiss of a blood pressure cuff squeezing my arm served as my only companion. I was a mother now, yet my arms remained empty. Hours later, the heavy door creaked open. A night nurse stepped inside, carrying my leather tote bag and a small cup of ice chips. "You are doing very well, Emma," she whispered, setting the items on the rolling tray beside my bed. "The NICU attending will come by shortly to update you on your daughter. She is holding her own. Do you want me to try calling your husband again?" "No," I replied, the single syllable scraping against my dry throat. "Let him sleep." The nurse nodded sympathetically and exited, leaving me alone in the shadowed quiet. I ignored the ice chips. I reached for the leather tote. My fingers brushed the cold aluminum chassis of my laptop, tracing the edges before finding my smartphone tucked into the side pocket. I pressed the power button. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh, pale light across my face in the darkened hospital room. Amidst a sea of unread promotional emails and generic calendar reminders, a single push notification dominated the lock screen. It was an automated alert from the commercial lender. Account status update. Equity release finalized. Disbursement scheduled. Loan funding in 48 hours. A ticking clock materialized in the center of my mind. 2 days. The bank would open its digital doors on Monday morning. The wire transfer would process draining $400,000 from my property into David's offshore shell company. If that money moved across international lines, tracing and recovering it would require years of federal litigation. I would be fighting a protracted, expensive war while trying to pay astronomical NICU bills for a premature infant. I looked toward the hallway, picturing my fragile newborn fighting for every breath inside a plastic box. My physical body was fractured, stitched together, and heavily medicated. Yet my mind possessed a singular, terrifying clarity. David believed I was incapacitated. He assumed his timeline was flawless. He forgot the skill set of the woman he married. I pulled the laptop from the bag and rested it on my lap. I had 48 hours to dismantle a financial syndicate before the bank opened. The sharp odor of aged scotch clung to the sterile hospital air long after David walked out the door. He left behind a suffocating silence, confident he had intimidated a vulnerable woman into signing away her future. My ribs ached with every shallow breath. The surgical incision burned beneath the heavy cotton blankets. Yet my mind operated with a terrifying crystalline focus. He believed I was a fractured victim. He forgot I dismantled corporate financial structures for a living. I pulled my laptop closer, balancing the aluminum base across my knees. The digital clock in the corner of the screen indicated I had less than 12 hours before the bank opened and the fraudulent loan processed. I opened 3 separate browser windows. The first connected to our joint financial portfolio. The second accessed the state property registry. The third linked directly to the federal fraud reporting portal for commercial lenders. I started with the cash. David and I maintained separate primary accounts, but we shared a high-yield savings fund and 3 premium credit lines. Using my administrative privileges, I initiated a total freeze on every shared asset. I typed in the security commands, changing the primary authentication codes to a newly generated sequence only I possessed. With a final keystroke, the joint savings account balance vanished from his view, locked behind a fortress of banking encryption. The credit limits dropped to 0. Next, I targeted the home equity loan. David forged my signature using a specific remote online notary drive belonging to his business partner. I drafted an urgent electronic affidavit attaching the network logs I had extracted from his desktop. The logs proved the digital stamp originated from his IP address, while I was physically admitted to the maternity ward. I submitted the dossier to the bank's primary fraud division and forwarded a copy to the state licensing board. A red banner materialized across the loan application status page. The $400,000 disbursement was instantly canceled. Finally, I secured the battleground. Before our wedding, my grandmother insisted I retain her estate attorney to draft a prenuptial agreement. David had skimmed the document, too arrogant to consult his own counsel. He missed the standard severability clause buried in the final pages. It stated clearly that any attempt by one spouse to fraudulently encumber the other's primary residence immediately nullified their marital interest in the property. I forwarded the canceled fraudulent loan application to my attorney, instructing her to file the eviction paperwork immediately. The Washington house belonged solely to me. I closed the primary windows and opened a mobile banking tracking application. A feature designed to monitor budget limits now served as my surveillance feed. I leaned back against the stiff hospital pillows, watching the screen. David and Julian were dining at a high-end steakhouse in downtown Seattle, celebrating a financial victory that no longer existed. I watched the first notification populate on my screen. A charge for $840 from the restaurant, attempted to process on the joint platinum card. The status instantly updated to declined. I pictured the scene unfolding across town. David, wearing his tailored suit, handing the heavy metal card to a waiter. The waiter, returning a moment later, offering a polite, discreet apology. 2 minutes passed. A second notification appeared. David attempted to use a backup travel card. Declined. Another minute ticked by. A third attempt, this time using his digital wallet tied to our shared savings account. Insufficient funds. The financial oxygen in their luxury world evaporated in less than 5 minutes. David possessed no liquid assets outside of the shell companies he was using to launder money, and those accounts required days to clear international wire transfers. For the first time in his privileged life, my husband was standing inside an exclusive restaurant with 0 purchasing power. I minimized the banking application and opened the smart home security interface on my screen. The camera mounted above the garage illuminated the wet driveway in crisp, high-definition monochrome. The rain had intensified, falling in thick sheets across the concrete. 30 minutes later, an expensive black sedan pulled up to the curb. The rideshare driver did not pull into the driveway, clearly eager to drop off his agitated passengers. Julian stepped out first, slamming the door hard enough to shake the vehicle. David followed, his posture rigid, his hands gesturing frantically as they marched up the walkway. Even without audio, the escalating tension radiated through the screen. Julian turned around, blocking David from reaching the front porch. The younger brother pulled out his phone, shoving the illuminated screen into David's face. I knew exactly what Julian was showing him. It was a message from Julian's defense attorney. Without my money subsidizing the facade, the legal retainer Julian desperately needed had bounced. Julian realized the truth. The narrative David spun about having infinite resources about the home equity loan saving their grand enterprise was a fabricated illusion. The safety net was gone. The investors Julian defrauded were going to demand answers, and Julian had no lawyer to shield him. David swatted the phone away. He pointed a finger at Julian's chest, leaning forward to deliver a harsh reprimand. The toxic loyalty binding them shattered instantly. Julianne lunged forward, shoving David backward onto the wet concrete. David stumbled, his expensive leather shoes losing traction. He hit the ground hard, rolling onto his side. The refined, calculated businessman vanished, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. David scrambled to his feet and threw a reckless, uncoordinated punch that caught Julianne on the jaw. The brothers wrestled in the freezing downpour, tearing at expensive clothes, trading blows in the shadow of the house they plotted to steal from me. They had built an empire of lies, assuming my obedience would fund their survival. Without my money acting as a buffer, they tore each other apart. I watched the physical altercation with total clinical detachment. The fetal monitor beside my bed remained silent. The only sound in the hospital room was my steady, measured breathing. I did not feel pity. I did not feel sorrow. I felt a profound, sweeping sense of clarity. On the security feed, sweeping beams of red and blue light suddenly washed over the driveway, cutting through the heavy rain. 2 local police cruisers pulled up, boxing in the space behind the driveway. Officers stepped out, shouting commands, shining high-powered flashlights directly into the faces of the struggling men. Julian froze, throwing his hands in the air. David stayed on his knees, panting, shielding his eyes from the glare. An officer approached the porch holding a thick manila envelope sealed in plastic to protect it from the weather. It was the emergency eviction notice accompanied by a temporary restraining order my attorney had expedited through a duty judge. The officer separated the brothers, forcing them to stand in the downpour while the documents were served. They were officially barred from entering the property. I watched David read the front page of the legal packet. He looked up at the security camera mounted above the door. Even through the grainy monochrome feed, I saw the exact moment his arrogance fractured into genuine terror. He realized his pregnant wife had not retreated to the guest room to cry. She had retreated to build a guillotine. A soft knock pulled my attention away from the screen. A neonatal specialist walked into the room, her expression remarkably calm. She carried a tablet displaying a chart of vital signs. "Your daughter is stabilizing," the doctor said, offering a small, reassuring nod. Her heartbeat found a steady rhythm. She is a fighter. We are going to start weaning her off the oxygen support by morning. I let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension leaving my shoulders for the first time in days. The vulnerable infant in the incubator was surviving the storm. Her environment was secure. The threat had been removed from our home. My phone vibrated on the bedside table. A new message illuminated the screen. It was an email from David's legal counsel demanding an urgent mediation session to discuss the frozen accounts and the abrupt eviction. He was cornered, desperate to negotiate terms before the federal authorities uncovered the extent of his wire fraud scheme. I locked the phone and set it down. He wanted a negotiation. He was going to get an execution. 6 weeks later, the climax of my marriage unfolded inside the glass walls of a sterile mediation room in downtown Seattle. The space was designed for quiet, civilized severances, featuring neutral gray carpets and a long, polished mahogany table. The sweeping floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Puget Sound, where the water churned under heavy rain clouds. I sat on one side of the table, my posture straight, my hands folded neatly over a structured leather tote bag resting in my lap. My surgical incision had healed into a neat silver line. The fragile, terrified woman who fled her own home in the middle of a storm no longer existed. In her place sat a senior corporate auditor who had spent the last month and a half meticulously dissecting every lie her husband ever told. The heavy glass door clicked open. David walked in, flanked by his legal counsel, a notoriously ruthless litigator named Richard Sterling. David wore a charcoal-tailored suit, attempting to project an aura of unbothered confidence. He adjusted his silver cufflinks, pulled out a leather chair, and sat directly across from me. He offered a tight, patronizing smile. He believed he still held the upper hand. He assumed the legal system would protect his entitlement, just as his family had always shielded him from the consequences of his actions. Sterling did not waste time with pleasantries. He opened a slim leather briefcase, extracted a single printed document, and slid it toward the center of the mahogany table. "My client is prepared to be generous," Sterling began, his voice smooth and practiced. "We understand the postpartum period is immensely difficult. We recognize that hormonal fluctuations can cause erratic, unpredictable behavior. Therefore, David is willing to overlook the dramatic eviction notice and your unauthorized freezing of his legitimate marital assets." My attorney, a sharp and brilliant financial litigator named Sarah, did not flinch. She simply raised an eyebrow, waiting for the opponent to spring his trap. Sterling tapped the document with his index finger. "The terms are straightforward. Emma will immediately unfreeze the joint savings fund. She will withdraw the baseless fraud report regarding the remote notary drive. She will vacate the restraining order, allowing David to return to his primary residence. In exchange, David will graciously agree to joint custody of your infant daughter. If these terms are rejected, we will file an emergency motion for sole custody by noon. We will cite your client's documented emotional instability and erratic financial sabotage as definitive proof she is unfit to parent." David leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with smug, arrogant satisfaction. He thought he had found my ultimate vulnerability. He believed that threatening to take my child would break my resolve and force me to surrender my wealth to his control. The silence in the room stretched. The low hum of the ceiling air conditioning unit became the only sound. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice in righteous indignation to defend my sanity. I felt a profound, sweeping sense of clinical detachment. I looked at the man I once loved and saw nothing but a failed investment, a toxic liability that needed to be liquidated. I reached into my leather tote bag. I pulled out a thick, spiral-bound file. It contained over 200 pages of printed network logs, corporate registry documents, banking transcripts, and intercepted emails. I placed the heavy file on the mahogany table and pushed it across the polished surface. It stopped directly in front of David. "What is this?" David asked, his patronizing smile faltering slightly as he stared at the intimidating stack of paper. "That is your execution," I said, my voice steady, cold, and devoid of any emotion. Sterling frowned, reaching for the folder. He flipped past the heavy cardstock cover. His eyes scanned the first page. As an experienced financial attorney, it took him less than 10 seconds to recognize the gravity of the evidence. The color rapidly drained from the lawyer's face. "Let me explain the contents to you," I continued, keeping my gaze locked on David. "While you were out celebrating at a steakhouse 6 weeks ago, I mirrored the hard drive of your home office computer. I traced the specific IP addresses for the corporate shell companies you registered in Delaware. I found the offshore accounts you opened solely under your own name." David shifted in his chair. His confident posture began to unravel, his shoulders dropping as the reality of my words set in. "I also read the encrypted email threads between you and your offshore financial consultants," I said, leaning forward just an inch. "Julian was never the mastermind behind the cryptocurrency fraud. You were. You used Julian's failing tech startup as a front to launder your own money. You invited him to move into our house not out of brotherly loyalty, but to keep your oblivious fall guy under strict surveillance. You orchestrated the federal wire fraud, and you explicitly instructed your consultants to isolate Julian's name on all the primary liability documents." David opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. His jaw worked silently. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. "You planned to steal the equity from my house, transfer the funds offshore, and leave your own brother to face the federal indictments alone?" I stated, laying his entire conspiracy bare under the harsh fluorescent lights. "You are not a victim of his incompetence. You are the architect of his ruin. And you tried to make me pay for it." Sterling closed the file, pushing it away as if the paper itself were radioactive. He looked at his client, his professional composure shattered. "David, did you disclose any of this federal exposure to me?" David stared at the folder, his hands trembling against the mahogany wood. His smug arrogance disintegrated into dust. He was vanquished by his own hubris, caught in a trap he designed for someone else. Sarah folded her hands on the table, delivering the final lethal blow. Here are our terms. You will sign the dissolution of marriage today. You will surrender all claims to the Washington property and forfeit any right to the frozen marital assets. You will assume sole liability for the corporate shell companies you created, and you will relinquish all custody rights to the child. David shook his head, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. I cannot do that. The debt will ruin me. The federal investigators are already questioning Julian. If you refuse to sign, Sarah replied, her tone glacial, Emma will hand that entire dossier to the federal prosecutor whose office is located 3 floors below us in this exact building. You can either walk away with crushing debt, or you can walk away in handcuffs. The choice is yours. The checkmate was perfect. David possessed no leverage. His threat regarding child custody was a hollow bluff, obliterated by the overwhelming weight of his own criminal conspiracy. He looked across the table, desperately searching my face for a trace of the forgiving, accommodating wife he had manipulated for years. He found only a wall of ice. Without uttering a single word, David reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out an expensive fountain pen. His hand shook so severely he could barely grip the barrel. He signed the dissolution agreement. He signed the asset forfeiture. He signed away his rights to a daughter he never truly wanted. He legally forced himself to assume all the federal debt he created, trading his entire future for the temporary illusion of freedom. My own empire remained utterly untouchable. When the ink dried, I stood up, smoothed the front of my tailored skirt, and walked out of the sterile mediation room without looking back. The resolution of my marriage did not leave me feeling empty. It left me liberated. A week later, the commercial bank finalized the cancellation of the fraudulent loan, securing the equity safely back into my property. I did not need that specific money for my survival. My career provided ample resources to rebuild my life and provide for my daughter. But I vividly remembered the terrifying isolation of the neonatal intensive care unit. I remembered the exhausted mothers sitting in stiff plastic chairs, terrified of both the blinking medical monitors and the mounting hospital bills they could not afford, delivering perfect angelic justice. I transferred a sum of my own corporate bonuses equivalent to the recovered equity directly into a specialized grant fund at Seattle General Hospital. The endowment was structured specifically to clear the medical debts of stranded mothers whose premature infants required emergency and ICU care. True justice did not require public recognition. It merely required action. The wealth David intended to use for his selfish criminal escape now provided a vital lifeline for women fighting genuine battles. The narrative ends not in a courtroom, but in the quiet, peaceful sanctuary of my own home. The rain returned to Washington, tapping a gentle, rhythmic cadence against the roof. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of lavender and clean cotton. The nursery was restored to its rightful state. The mahogany crib stood secure and whole in the center of the room. I sat in the plush nursing chair, rocking gently back and forth. My daughter rested against my chest, her breathing deep, even, and strong. She was healthy, thriving, and entirely mine. She was swaddled in a soft muslin blanket, subtly patterned with intricate lunar zodiac animals that caught the dim light of the bedside lamp. I traced the silver handle of my grandmother's rattle, which now sat safely on the changing table nearby. I had faced the ultimate betrayal and emerged victorious. I successfully refused to carry the burden of my husband's lies. I protected my child, secured my domain, and rewrote the ending of my own story. The storm outside could rage as loud as it wanted. Inside these walls, we were finally safe. The faint scent of lavender still lingers in the quiet corners of the restored nursery, a delicate reminder of the storm that nearly swept everything away. When we think about building a traditional family in America, we often picture the physical markers of success: the sprawling two-story craftsman house, the manicured lawn, the perfectly assembled mahogany crib waiting for a newborn. We are taught to value this structure, to see the nuclear family as the ultimate sanctuary against a chaotic world. But as the dust settles on the wreckage of my marriage, a profound realization takes root in the silence. A traditional family structure is only a protective shell. Without the foundational pillars of honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness, it is nothing more than a beautifully decorated trap. The true essence of family responsibility extends far beyond merely providing a roof or maintaining the outward appearance of success. For generations, American culture has sometimes conflated loyalty with complicity. We see it in the way David was raised. His mother conditioned him to believe that protecting the family name meant burying the truth, that loyalty meant covering for his brother's crimes, and that maintaining a facade of wealth was worth sacrificing the very soul of his household. This is the toxic inheritance of misplaced loyalty. When we prioritize the illusion of a perfect family over the messy, difficult truth, we are not protecting our children. We are handing them a blueprint for their own future destruction. We are teaching them that love is conditional, tied to their ability to keep the family's darkest secrets hidden from the light. As I sit in the plush nursing chair rocking my thriving daughter, I think about the long-term guidance I owe her. The responsibility of parenting is not merely to shield a child from the harshness of the world, but to equip them with the moral compass required to navigate it. If I had stayed quiet, if I had surrendered to David's intimidation to keep the traditional family unit intact, what lesson would I have passed down to my daughter? I would have taught her that a woman's peace is the acceptable price for a man's comfort. I would have modeled a life where fairness is an abstract concept, easily discarded when it becomes inconvenient for those in power. By choosing to dismantle the lies, I chose to give her the only inheritance that truly matters: a life rooted in unwavering honesty. Honesty in parenting is not just about telling the truth when asked. It is about living in the truth, even when it cost you the life you thought you were building. Children are incredibly perceptive. They do not learn their values from the lectures we give them. They absorb the atmosphere we create. They watch how we handle conflict, how we respond to betrayal, and how we enforce our boundaries. Emotional awareness, the ability to recognize our own worth and the courage to demand respect, is taught through action. When David dismantled our daughter's crib to make room for his fraudulent brother, he wasn't just taking apart a piece of furniture. He was demonstrating a profound lack of emotional awareness and respect for the life we were bringing into the world. He was signaling that our child's space and her mother's well-being were secondary to his ego. To raise a child with a strong sense of fairness, a parent must first demonstrate what it means to be fair to oneself. We cannot teach our children to stand up against injustice if we tolerate it in our own living rooms. American culture often glorifies maternal sacrifice, painting the image of the long-suffering mother who endures endless indignities to keep the family together. But true maternal strength is not found in silent endurance. It is found in the fierce, uncompromising protection of a child's environment. It is found in the willingness to burn down a corrupt kingdom so your daughter does not have to grow up breathing the smoke. The traditional family structure is a beautiful ideal, but it must be an ecosystem of mutual respect, transparency, and shared ethical standards. The moment it becomes a hierarchy where one partner is allowed to siphon the resources, peace, and security of the other under the guise of family loyalty, it ceases to be a family. It becomes a hostage situation. I want my daughter to grow up understanding that a home is not defined by the walls that enclose it, or even by the presence of two parents, but by the safety and truth that exist within it. Family responsibility means taking accountability for your actions, not forcing the people who love you to pay for your mistakes. This journey was never just about a stolen home equity loan or a remote notary drive. It was about defining the moral baseline for the next generation. It was about proving that the cycles of generational deception can be broken. By forcing David to face the federal consequences of his actions, I was setting the ultimate boundary for my daughter's life. I was showing her that fairness is an execution of justice that sometimes requires clinical detachment from those who seek to harm you. We are all builders, constructing the emotional houses our children will inhabit long after we are gone. If you find yourself making excuses for the people who are supposed to keep you warm, take a hard look at the foundation of your own home. It takes terrifying courage to refuse to carry the burden of someone else's lies. But the peace that follows, the quiet serenity of a life built on truth, is worth every moment of the storm. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever had to fight to protect the emotional and financial sanctuary of your own family, you are not alone. There is strength in sharing these truths and exposing the shadows that hide behind closed doors. Please subscribe to Salt Vengeance. Join our community. Share your own stories in the comments and walk with us as we continue to explore the resilience of the human spirit in the face of betrayal. As I watch the steady rise and fall of my daughter's chest, swaddled in her blanket, I listen to the Washington rain continuing its endless rhythm against the glass. The storm outside will always be there, a chaotic force we can never truly control. We can only control the strength of our own walls and the purity of the light we keep burning inside. But as the night deepens and the shadows stretch across the nursery floor, I am left with a lingering, quiet question, one that haunts the edges of every perfectly manicured American suburb. When we lock our doors at night to keep the danger out, how often do we realize that we have already locked it inside? What lies are sleeping in your house, waiting for the right moment to wake up?